Okay, good evening. We are up to the second part of this discussion, which is in our numbers here at Sugya 1.6, and it is on is in a regular Gemara. It should be Chavavim and Beis. Okay, so just to get back into the swing of things. What we had before was that, if you remember in the beginning of 1.6, we had a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina said that the forefathers were the ones who created the tefillos. They were the ones who, so to speak, invented them. And Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi says that the tefillos were established by the Anshe Netzach Yisroel, the people, the men of the Great Assembly, and they were corresponding to the daily sacrifices that were brought in the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so we have a considerable difference between those two. One is the forefathers all the way back to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi held that it was made by the men of the Great Assembly, which actually was established in the time of the Purim story, close to the Purim story, time of, hi, good evening. How you doing?
Good.
You are?
He's joining
Yosef.
Abergel, he's going to join us in the shir tonight.
How you doing?
He's in UK.
Welcome in, Yosef. Nice to meet you.
Josh, Seth, can you sit next to you so you can follow? Yeah, that's fine. You can follow. There's a whole holla.
Okay, so the men of the Great Assembly were established and created in the time of the exile in Bavel, in between the two Batei Mikdash, and they went for a while into the times of the second Commonwealth. So that's who created prayer. So you have a machlokas over here. So the Gemara, if you remember, we already did this, but I'm just going back over it. The Gemara says that we have a brisa that supported Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, that it was the forefathers who did it. And we have another brisa that also supported the other opinion of Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi, who said that it was the Anshe Netzach Yisroel corresponding to the sacrifices. We had two brises, and each one supported one view and one supported the other view. In other words, this machlokas between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi actually predates them. It's a machlokas from the Tanoim time, right? It wasn't only from the Gemara time of the Amoraim, but actually you find precedent for this in the times of the Amoraim, times of the Tanoim, I mean. And we went through step by step the first of the brises, which was Tanya Kavasei de Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. We had a brisa which is similar to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, which means it supports Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. And if you remember, I'm not going to go into the whole detail anymore right now, but if you remember, the brisa went through step by step how Avram Avinu established Shachris, and we proved that from Psukim. Yitzchak established Mincha, went through both Psukim. And Yaakov established Mariv, and we went through Psukim on that. We came to that conclusion. Okay. So the first Brisa supported the first opinion, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, that it was from the Avos. Right? And that's clear. Right? That Brisa is very clear that they're holding like that. We now go to the second part. Vitanya Kavasei de Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And we have what does Vitanya mean? A brisa, good. Kavasei, like or similar to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. To Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. We have a brisa which is like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi also. Meaning, just like we said in the beginning, that we have a brisa that supports Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, which we just brought, we had brought before. And now we're about to bring the second brisa, which supports Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who says that it was established by the Anshe Netzach Yisroel corresponding to the daily sacrifices. So now let's read this brisa. This is a long-winded brisa. It has several different steps. But when you read this brisa, it becomes very obvious that the prayers were established corresponding to the daily sacrifices, which is exactly what Rabbi Yisroel Roll says. Let's take a look. What does the brisa say? So the brisa just asks a question, which is why it's up in red. Mipnei ma amru, because of what did they say? Tfilas hashachar ad chatzos. If you're following along in the formatted, it's on page 4. Because of what did they say that Tfilas HaShachar, that the morning prayer, Shacharis, is until Chatzos, until midday? Why did they say that it was until midday? As if the Brisa was saying, like, why did the Chachamim pick that timing? Like, why is that? So I'll tell you why. Shaharei, here's the Brisa's answer, Shaharei, for behold, Tamid Shel Shachar, the daily sacrifice, the Tamid of the morning. The Tamid is the daily sacrifice that came every single morning, for and until it stopped in the time of almost the Second Temple's destruction. For every single day, except when the Beis Mikdash wasn't standing, it was a daily sacrifice. Once in the morning, one sheep in the morning, one sheep in the afternoon. So the Tamid Shel Shachar, the daily sacrifice of the morning, was Kara V'holech, could be brought and continued ad Chatzos, until midday. So the first point in the Brisa is, you want to know why that they said that you can daven Shacharis until midday? Answer, because that's the timing for the morning sacrifice in the Beis HaMikdash. Ah, there we go. Oh, the Brisa says it pretty black and white, right? That it's corresponding to the sacrifice. Morning Shacharis is corresponding to the morning sacrifice. Since the morning sacrifice can go until midday, so that means Shacharis can go until midday too. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and Rabbi Yehuda says, Ad Arba Shos, until 4 hours. Why does he say until 4 hours? We've had Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in our Mishnah that you can only daven until 4 hours. Why does he hold that? Well, guess what? Shaharei, for behold, Tamid Shel Shachar, the morning sacrifice, Karei V'holech, can be brought and continued ad arba shos, until 4 hours. Which, put in simple English, that means that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the first opinion, with the Tanna Kama, about the timing for the daily sacrifice. The first opinion says that the daily sacrifice can be brought all the way until midday. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not true. You can only be brought until 4 hours. Correct? Well, now I know where their opinions come from when it comes to prayer, right? Because the machlokas on prayer that we had in our Mishnah is directly dependent on the machlokas about the daily sacrifice. It didn't start with prayer, it started with the daily sacrifice. Prayer was a result of the daily sacrifice. Because the daily sacrifice, according to the first opinion, could be brought until 6 hours, so you can daven Shacharis until 6 hours, according to the first opinion. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, since the daily sacrifice could only be brought until 4 hours, so hence you can only daven Shacharis until 4 hours. That's the machlokas. So, you have to find out where the starting point is. When you want to analyze what a machlokas is, you have to start with you have to get back to the root of the thing. Find out where the source is. Okay. So that is part 1 of the Brisa. Now, next part of the Brisa. Okay, we talked about Shacharis. Now let's talk about the next one. Umipnei ma amru. And because of what did they say? Tfilas HaMincha ad ha'erev, that the tefillah of mincha, that mincha is ad ha'erev, is until evening. Why did they say that? Why did they pick that timing? Answer, Shaharei Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, for behold, that the daily sacrifice, the Tamid of the afternoon, Shel Ben Arbayim, right? The afternoon daily sacrifice. Remember, I told you that there were two every day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. The daily sacrifice of the afternoon was Kara v'holech, could be sacrificed, could be brought and continued ad ha'erev, until evening. Huh? So you want to know why it is that you can daven mincha until evening? Answer, because that's when the daily sacrifice of the afternoon was brought. And the mincha is corresponding to that. That's the answer. Straightforward. And as you would perhaps guess, in chimes Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, oh, 1 second. Rabbi Yehuda says, ad plag hamincha. It's until plag hamincha. If you remember, we said that plag hamincha is halfway into the smaller mincha, which is, well, the smaller mincha is the later half of mincha, which is from 9.5 hours until 12. So if you split that in half, the midpoint is 10 3/4. It's an hour and a quarter proportional hours before the end of the day. And that's plag hamincha, and Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion you could only daven mincha until then. Why? Well, you guessed it, folks. Shaharei tamid shel bein ha'arbayim, because the daily sacrifice of the afternoon, karev v'holech, can be brought and continued ad plag hamincha, until plag hamincha. Okay? Put in short, there's another machlokas. And again, the machlokas that we know from the Mishnah about when you can daven mincha, whether you have all the way until, let's call it shkia, or whether you should daven mincha only until plag mincha. We had that in the Mishnah. Well, now you know where it comes from. It comes from a machlokas on the sacrifice. When's the last time you can bring the daily afternoon sacrifice? According to the Tanakama, you can bring it all day until sunset. And as according to Rabbi Yehuda, no, it's not true. You can do it only until plag hamincha. And therefore, as a result of that machlokas, you have the machlokas, as a consequence of that, you have a machlokas on the prayer time, because the prayers are corresponding to the sacrifices. Good? Okay? Next. Umipnei ma amru, and because of what did they say? Tfilas ha'erev ein lo kava, or kva. Why did they say that Mariv has no set time, which means that you can daven Mariv all night long? Why did they say that? Well, I'll tell you why. Shaharei, for behold, Eivarim upidarim, the limbs and the fats, shalonis aklu, that were not consumed, mi ba'erev, from before evening, they were not consumed by evening time, krevim v'holchim kol halayla, they can be sacrificed, they can be brought and continued the whole night. Now let me just take a sidebar over here for a minute and explain what that means. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, of course, everybody knows that they would bring animal sacrifices during the day. Okay? Now the rule of thumb in the Beis HaMikdash runs as follows. The actual sacrifice, the procedure of the sacrifice itself, had to be done during daylight hours. We learn it out from a pasuk. So when you slaughter it and accept the blood and you bring the blood on the altar and all that stuff, all of that has to be done during the day. However, the burning of the limbs and fats, which go onto the Mizbeach and get burned up on the fires on the Mizbeach, those do not have to be done during the day. They can be done at night. As long as they are put on the Mizbeach sometime before dawn of the next morning, you're good. Okay? Sometimes a lot of work piled up, and there were sometimes hundreds, sometimes even thousands of sacrifices that would come, depending on the time of the year. Sometimes it was somewhat quiet, and sometimes it was extremely busy. Like on Yom Tov time, thousands of people would come with their sacrifices. So sometimes, there was a backlog. So that's the way it was. So you could, as long the Kohanim kept track of things, there was a whole system in the Beis Hamikdash to keep track of what's going on over here. It was, they did it without a computer, by the way. That was just a sign. They used to have a very big, tagging system and making sure that they kept track of what's going on. And that's why there were Levim over there to keep track of what was doing. And it was complicated. There were a lot of different people bringing a lot of different karbanos. So, but in any case, sometime during the course of the day, all the sacrifices had to be slaughtered and the procedure had to be made. But as far as the burning, that can be done even at night. Okay? Somehow it had to get up there on the fires on the top of the Mizbeach sometime before dawn of the next day. And that is what Mariv is. So do you hear? The morning sacrifice, called the Tamid Shel Shachar, that they placed correspondingly Shachris. The afternoon sacrifice, they placed corresponding to that Mincha. What was the Mariv corresponding to? Mariv corresponded to the burning of the limbs and fats from these karbanos all night long, and that is why the Brisa says it had no set time, because as long as you could get those fats and limbs on top of the mizbeach before dawn, you were good. It didn't have a set time as long as it was, you got it on sometime during the night. So that's why Mariv is the same thing. By the way, you want to hear a cute thing? Not cute, I don't know if that's the right word exactly. But interesting point, okay? The only part of the sacrifice which is not absolutely necessary, and it's still kosher if you don't do it, is the burning of the fats and the limbs. That is to say, if you have a sacrifice and you do the procedure of it, you slaughter it and you bring the blood, etc., etc., those things, the procedural things that happen during the day, if you bring it, it's a kosher sacrifice, and you achieve whatever it is that you were supposed to achieve. Whatever atonement or whatever it is that you were supposed to bring, you're supposed to accomplish with that, you achieved it. If for some reason that the fats and the limbs never got onto the altar that night, now that's not the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to get it on there. But if it didn't get there, you don't bring them the next day. They are puzzle, but the sacrifice was still good. The sacrifice was still valid. Whatever atonement or whatever it is that you were supposed to accomplish with that sacrifice, that was still good and you still had it. Even though it wasn't done 100%, but it's valid.
Can't eat it.
Can't eat that, but...
They end up burning it completely.
Well, it depends on the sacrifice. Certain sacrifices you have more time to eat.
The fats.
No. The fats and the fats go onto the mizbeach. The other meat, it depends on the sacrifice. So I don't want to get into too much detail about that, but the interesting point of it is, though, the reason why I point this out is because that Mariv, which is the corresponding prayer, We hold, now it's a Gemara later on, we hold that Mariv is effectively Rishus. Rishus means it's optional. Really, Mariv is optional. Now, we have accepted it, the poskim say, as if that it was an actual obligation, and therefore everybody davens Mariv. But basically, it's optional, the Gemara says later on. And that's a curiosity because it makes a lot of sense. Because it's corresponding to the part of the sacrifices which is in effect optional. It doesn't have to come in order for the sacrifice to be valid. Follow me? Every other part of the procedure of the sacrifice has to come. If you don't do it right, it is puzzle and the sacrifice is not valid. Okay? So if for some reason, just to give you an idea, they're very, very careful about those things, certain things. If you slaughtered the sacrifice and it wasn't the Kohen who collected the blood, that's it, puzzle. You got to bring a new one. If the Kohen collected the blood but tripped and fell and the blood fell onto the ground, depends on the situation. Sometimes that's puzzle. You didn't. It's gone, right? If you sprinkle it onto the mizbeach but you don't do it right, it may be puzzle also, right? That's all true with. Okay, yeah. Also wrong kavanas. It can also puzzle, right? But that's all true in the procedural stuff, but not when it comes to the burning of the fats and the limbs. That the thing that you think of when you do a carbon, you think about that it gets smoked on top of the altar, right? That's the thing that you think about, right? That's what everybody thinks about when you bring a carbon, right? Oh, it gets burned on the altar, right? In fact, that's the one part that happens to be that you don't have to have, right? If you do all the rest of the stuff, but you don't burn it on the altar, it's kosher. That's what Mariv is corresponding to, and that's the reason why Mariv is only optional, essentially, because it's corresponding to the limbs and fats, and that itself is only optional. It's really not. It's not obligatory. Yes.
And we're talking about the limbs and fats that were the sacrifices of Mincha and Mariv, Shachris and Mincha.
Also, yes.
That's where those are coming from.
Well, they could be dozens.
And there's thousands of cows, right? So sacrifices.
They could have been for.
All that's left over from. Anyway, it's basically. Yeah,
Well, it wasn't only the daily sacrifice that we're talking about, although it's true. We are talking about the daily sacrifice as well. But anybody could bring their own personal sacrifices for any number of reasons, and those are included too.
Yeah, as long as it was during the day.
Right, exactly. As long as it was during the day. Okay, so that's now you know the reason for Shacharis, Mincha, and Mariv, corresponding to the various parts of the sacrifices. Okay, all right. Well, we're not finished with the Brisa, but the Brisa speaks for itself very clearly that it was obviously corresponding to the sacrifices, and it was not like the first Brisa said that it was back from the Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but it's corresponding to the sacrifices clearly, right? Okay, that's why this Brisa is a support to Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi. Let's continue on. Umipnei ma amru, and because of what did they say? Shal musafim kol hayom. The musaf could be brought all day long. So when you have Shabbos has a musaf, Rosh Chodesh, Chol HaMoed, any of these times that you have a musaf, so you can bring it all day long. Why did they say that a musaf could be brought all day long? Oh, by now you probably guessed it. Shaharei, for behold, Karban shal musafim, the Karban, the sacrifice of the musaf. In other words, if you remember from musaf prayer, let's say we did yesterday, right? We daven Uvayom HaShabbos, and on the day of Shabbos, Shnei Kvasim, 2 sheep, Bnei Shana Tamimim, right? 2 sheep, 1 year old, perfect, right? That was in addition to the daily sacrifice, right? That's why, hence the term musaf. Musaf means added, like lahosif, right? Added, additional. So, why can the Musaf be brought all day long? Tell you why. Because the Karban Musaf can be brought all day long, so the Tefillah of Musaf can also be prayed all day long, because it's corresponding to the Karban. Okay, now if you remember the Mishnah, in the Mishnah it was actually in parentheses, but the Mishnah did add in Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ad Sheva Shos, until 7 hours. Right? Rabbi Yehuda disagreed again with that point. And Rabbi Yehuda says that you don't have all day for the Karban Musaf like the first opinion held, but rather you have only until 7 hours. Right? Guess why? Because Shaharei, for behold, Karban Musaf Kara v'holech ad Sheva Shos. Because the Karban Musaf could be brought and continued until 7 hours. Which means, in other words, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the Tanakama yet again. So we have 4 different machloks and 4 different disagreements on each one of these prayers, right? Exactly when they're allowed to be prayed, until when they're allowed to be prayed. And each one, the Brisa says, it didn't start with prayer, it started with the sacrifices. Depending on when you could bring the sacrifice, that's when you can daven that particular prayer. Okay? So each time Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama square off about exactly what the timing was of the sacrifice. And hence, as a consequence of that, they end up arguing about when is the timing for the prayers. Okay? Good? Okay. So we have this whole brisa that just told you very clearly that everything is corresponding to the sacrifices. Next. Now the brisa does something which is a little funny here. I can't really claim to know why the brisa does this, but the brisa seems to go off like on a tangent. And it's interesting to note that the brisa goes off on this tangent, and it's a tangent about something that the brisa never mentioned. So you really can't claim to know exactly why this brisa does this, but the brisa does it. Ve'ezohi mincha gedola. And what is mincha gedola? In case you were wondering what is mincha gedola. So the brisa, now, like I said, I'm not sure exactly why all of a sudden we switch subjects and start talking about this, but for some reason the brisa is doing this. I guess this is some sort of, maybe there's a much larger brisa that talks about other things about prayer, I'm not sure. But meanwhile, the brisa now poses the question, what is mincha gedola? When I use that phrase, the larger mincha, what is that? Misheish sha'os umechza, from 6 hours and a half, ulamala, and up. 6.5 hours. So according to our proportional hours, right, which if you remember, we had our chart here. Thank you very much. We had our chart. If you remember, so midday was right over here at the end of 6 hours. So if I would make a chart, if I would chart this, so the Bryce is telling you that mincha gedola is from 6.5 hours. Okay? 6.5 hours. So, this, when I put over here, this, for mincha, right? This is actually, it says it from chatzos, and really the Bryce is telling you it's from mincha gedola. It's a half an hour later. This is a big discussion which is beyond the scope of our shir right now as to which one is it? Is it 6.5 or 6 even? Is it chatzos or half an hour? And it seems like it seems to be conflicting conflicting information about it. Some sources seem to imply you can do it already at Chatzos, and some imply that you have to wait half an hour. This is a big subject of discussion amongst the Rishonim. It's beyond the scope of what we can talk about. But meanwhile, that's what mincha is. The ezo hi mincha ketana. And what is the smaller mincha? Teisha sha'os umechza u'lamau. From 9 hours and a half and up. So again, that means you count 9 hours plus a half, which is halfway through the 10th hour, correct? That's fine. Okay? We set that up, and okay. So according to the Brisa, we have now identified what Mincha Gedola is and Mincha Ketana. According to many Rishonim, it is better to daven mincha in the mincha ketana in the latter half. Not everybody agrees to that, but there are many who hold like that. Again, for reasons that we're not going to get into now. Now, if you're going to learn like that, then we understand that it's not so good to catch these early minchas, according to those Rishonim, because these, 1:50, 2 o'clock minchas, 2:30 minchas, right? Those are maybe more convenient for certain people, depending on their schedule, but according to some Rishonim, it's actually not as proper to daven. You fulfill the obligation, because you can daven during mincha gedola, you can daven in the larger mincha, which already starts at either 12 o'clock or not 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, midday, or maybe half an hour past midday. And you can do that, and that's fine. That's called mincha gedola. That's those, all these 1:30 or 2 o'clock minchas. That's all based on mincha gedola. Mincha ketana is is later on in the afternoon, and that, according to many Rishonim, is the better one. Okay, why is that? According those Rishonim who hold like that, it's because that if you learn the karbanos, the discussion about the sacrifices, that the sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash, the afternoon sacrifice was usually processed in the later half of the afternoon, mincha ketana. So that's why that some Rishonim hold that the corresponding mincha should be done in the afternoon. However, everybody also agrees that you could have done it earlier, and when on a day when there was a specific reason to make it earlier, they could. A prime example of that was the Erev Pesach, when people were bringing tens of thousands of lambs for the Karban Pesach, right? And they had to process those things after the daily sacrifice of the afternoon. So they wanted to make the daily sacrifice of the afternoon pretty early in order to be able to process all those Karban Pesachs. Okay. Let's summarize what we got so far. At the end, we have just completed Sugya 1.6. At the end of the Sugya, what do we have? We have that. We had a machlokas between the two opinions, which still stood. Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina said that the prayers were made, invented, call it whatever it is, right? They were initiated by the Avos. Avram made Shachris, Yitzchak made Mincha, Yaakov was the one who made Mariv, and the other opinion, Rabbi Shimon Levi, says that it's not from the Avos, but rather it was the Anshe Knesset Agdola, and the Anshe Knesset Agdola said it corresponding to the daily sacrifices, And like we just finished this whole brisa explaining, each one corresponding to its sacrifice, and therefore the morning chakras has to be davened by the time that the morning daily sacrifice would be brought, and each opinion going according to their opinion. And so to mincha, and so to marv. Right? Got it? That's the way that it worked. Musaf is the same thing, etc. Right? Got it? Okay. Now, if you finish the Gemara, you would get the distinct impression. Okay, so you have a machlokas, right? You have two opinions. And not only have two opinions in the Gemara amongst the Amoraim, you have Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Yisroel Levi, both of whom were Amoraim, right? But we had that, a Tanya Kavasei, we have a brisa proving each one of those opinions, right? So you have a brisa supporting each one. So it would appear that you have a machlokas that already dates back to the time of the Tanoim, not only by the Amoraim, but we now have precedent to show that this Amoraic machlokas was actually, predates them, and was actually machlokas earlier from the time of the Tanoim and the Mishnayos. Yeah.
It seems that it didn't exactly rule out. Like, it seems like they both could fit.
Yeah. Go on.
So
They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
right,
Go.
So perhaps the Avos could have established the prayers, and the sacrifices could establish the times.
Okay. Very good. Okay. So Seth is suggesting that maybe these two brises, these two opinions, are not necessarily arguing the way that you would perhaps have learned in the Gemara, that they're arguing in two different machlokim. Maybe it's even a historical question. So Seth suggests that maybe they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Because it could be that the Avos set up the concept, but the Anshe Knesset Gdola were the ones who set it to the sacrifices to make the exact times. Very good. Very good. You're not the first person who suggested that. Because there are other Rishonim and Achronim who also suggest this. That maybe the two are really not mutually exclusive. And there's a concept here also, which I'm going to just perhaps elaborate upon what Seth just suggested. There's a concept that says like this. The Avos had a concept. The Avos made an idea. Avraham Avinu made an idea. You're supposed to engage your Creator in the morning. Sometime in the morning. Okay? But the Anshe Knesset Gdola decided that they were going to set that up in accordance to the daily sacrifice in the Beis HaMikdash. It's not that it excludes Avraham Avinu. It's not that Avraham Avinu didn't do it, according to that opinion, like Seth said, but rather they took it and they put Gedorim, put set boundaries on it and set things on it. That's what happened. And in fact, that's the way that it's brought amongst the the commentators on Tefillah, that they work with them as both true. That the Avos established the concept, and that the Anshe Knesset Gdola took the Korbanos and set the prayers to them. And in addition to which, the Avos, although they conceived of the idea of connecting with God in prayer at certain times of the day, that they conceived of. Avraham Avinu conceived of doing in the morning, Yitzchak in the afternoon, Yaakov at Marav. That they conceived of, that they understood to do that. But it wasn't an obligation on Klal Yisrael. The Jewish people were not obligated to follow that law. There was no law. It was something that they understood because of their depth of their connection to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, they recognize that this is what I should be doing, and it's a concept to do it. But just because Avram Avinu did something doesn't mean that we're all obligated to do it. Avram Avinu did a lot of things we're not obligated to do. Okay? Until we're asked by God, I won't suggest any of you taking your son and trying to sacrifice him. Okay? Please don't do that. Okay? Don't try that at home, right? Okay? Now, Avram Avinu did it, but, that does not obligate us. Okay? Don't do that. Okay? Avram Avinu went into the fiery cauldron. Okay? Unless push comes to shove and somebody throws you in, okay? Don't try that. But just because that Avram Avinu did something doesn't obligate it to us.
When are you obligated?
We became obligated when the Anshe Knesset Agdola, acting as the Sanhedrin and acting as the Rabbanon, who the Torah sanctions that we are obligated to listen to the Sanhedrin, listen to the Rabbanim. When they decided that there should be a daily prayer in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, well, evening maybe, we'll leave that out, maybe that's voluntary. But when they decided to do that, that's when we became obligated. So the concept may have been already from the Avos, but the obligation came only at the time of the Anshe Knesset Agdola, and that they decided to set the obligation in accordance with the daily sacrifice. So what Seth was talking about really has a lot of credence in the Mefarshim, in the various commentaries, that we assume that these are not mutually exclusive, but rather these actually go in tandem. And as I mentioned before, that there was a reason in the commentaries why Avram Avinu was the one who created Shacharis and Yitzchak Mincha, and it gets into a large discussion about what is the difference between engaging God in the morning versus engaging God in the afternoon versus engaging God in the evening. What do all these represent? What do the different times of the day represent? For instance, this gets into a bigger question, which is a very interesting philosophical discussion, which we're not going to get into here. But why did God have to make night and day anyway? He was making everything. He didn't have to make a night and a day. He could have done anything. He could have made day always. He could have done night always. He could have made it day would be not 24 hours. He could have made it 8 months. I don't know, whatever. He could have done anything he wanted, right? He chose it this way. Okay? It wasn't random. There was a reason. There was a reason for that. And it wasn't just because that God needed to go to sleep every night. That wasn't the reason. So he made us with the need to go to sleep, right? There's a reason why that is. And he made, he made certain animals nocturnal. There's a reason. There's a reason for everything. The Ribono Shel Olam has his reasons for everything. But there are different things that go on in the spiritual world between night and day and things like that. Why our sacrifices have to be done specifically during the day. All of these things are Kabbalistic concepts and are big philosophical discussions that are beyond the scope of our Gemara learning here. So if you want to continue on, if you want to get into Kabbalah, you're welcome to do so. But you'll have to call me at about 2:30 in the morning. Yeah. Well, yeah, okay.
You speak, Rabbi, for a moment. One minute, about what's shot in Baruch Shekivanta. That Seth, on his own, came up with this idea, just going to the Gemara and thinking about it, which reflects the Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah, that he brings both opinions. I think we should break out L'chaim, Schnapps, or and start dancing. Seth was mechavein to the Rishonim.
There we go.
Can you say that over?
Okay. Let me just point it out that you see great minds think alike. But that means like this, that what happened was that because that we were learning through the Gemaras, and Seth was thinking about what happened, what we had learned. So he got on his own that hey, maybe these two brises are not contradictory, but maybe they just fulfill each other, right? And in fact, that the other Rishonim, like we said, actually talk like that. So the idea here is that you see the dynamic of Torah, that you can, Torah was, given back from Moshe at Sinai, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh has been developing since then. But when you learn the Gemara, you're learning the same Gemara that the Rambam learned. He learned these same words. The Rambam, the Ramban, all the great commentators, Rashi, Rambam, they were learning the exact same words that we just learned tonight. Exact same thing. They had a deep understanding of what's going on, and we don't have such a deep anything. But every now and then, we have Seth Rabinowitz who comes up with a deeper understanding, and in fact, realizes that something that makes sense in the Gemara after learning it, and then you look into the Rishonim and you find out, great Jewish thinkers said this already 900 years ago, right? Okay, good. That means that you're on the right track. There's a Yiddish saying that it rings better in Yiddish. It just doesn't sound the same way in English. It says, "As geht auf den richtigen Weg, mit Schäfsach Menschen." Means if you're going on the right path, which means it's talking about learning. If you're going on the right path, you'll meet people, right? You should meet people, right? If like one of my rebbeim said, if you're thinking about the Gemara the right way, right, and you have a good question, look in the commentaries. You're going to find somebody who's going to talk about this, right? If you can't find anybody who talks about this in the last 1,000 years of Jewish thought, right, that means you're not on the right path. Because if you were on the right path, somebody talks about it, right? It's just a question of finding it, right? So, as Megeta from Richtige Weg, if you go on the right path, if you're learning the Gemara straight and you're learning it right, but Trefsach mentioned, you'll find people, right? You'll find the Rishonim, the Achronim, you'll find that the commentaries pick up, and there are a lot of awfully smart people who were doing this, and they were learning the same thing. So it's a beautiful thing when you have every now and then, like you mechav into such a thing. So I have a joke with my chavrusa. I have a joke with it. I say, like, I ask him a question, and then we look around and I say, "Oh, Tosus asked the question," right? It's right there on the side of the bench. So I joke with him. I say, "Oh, there's a proof that Tosus knew how to learn." Right? So I joke, and then tongue in cheek I say, "I only wish that I had more proofs that Tosus knew how to learn." Right? Obviously, it's a Baruch Hashem. For once in a while that I pick up that Tosus I ask Tosus question. I say, "Oh, okay, good, Baruch Hashem." That means my head is still working at least a little bit. So, so that's wonderful.
Where it said, Rav Soloveitchik said, the Rov said that when you learn and you say Mechaben to a Rishonim or an Achronim, right, they come and sit down next to you. Ki'ilu. The Rambam sits down next to Seth, and sits next down to Eli, and says, "Seth, you're saying good." Rashi comes and sits down and says, yeah, I'm here.
There we go.
You're bringing them. You're mamish bringing the Rambam and Rashi sitting down next to us, learning Torah with us. It's like mamish transcending the generations.
Yeah, somebody said that the Daf Gemara on a Vilna page, right, is, it covers everywhere, because once you read the Daf Gemara, you're going to have the Mishnah was in Eretz Yisrael, the Talmud was in Bavel, Babylonia, right? Rashi was in France. Tosfos is in Germany, France. Then you look at Rabbeinu Hananel on the side. He was in North Africa. I mean, it goes all over the place. The Bach was in Poland, right? Rabbi Kiva Eger was in Poland, Lithuania, Spain. Right here on the Daf Gemara, you got 1,000 years of Jewish history right in front of you from all over the place. And it all meets at the Daf Gemara. All right, very good. Gentlemen, thank you very much, and have a wonderful Yom Tov, Ksiva Chazim Tova, and I hope that everybody has a good, sweet New Year.